Last time we spoke about the fall of Guam and actions in New Guinea. General Shepard's Marines had secured the Orte Peninsula, with General Turnge's Marines pushing the Japanese northwards. General Bruce's 77th Division prepared for an eastward assault, and engineers attempted but failed to build a supply road to Yona. Geiger's offensive began on July the 31st, with Marines quickly capturing Agana and advancing despite dense jungle and resistance. The 77th Division faced tough terrain, but they liberated over 2,000 Guamanians. The push north continued, facing logistical challenges and mined roads. By August the 7th, coordinated attacks cleared some key areas, culminating in the defeat of the remaining Japanese forces by August the 11th. Guam was back in American hands, although scattered Japanese forces continued guerrilla warfare until the war's conclusion. Thus, the Marianas campaign had finally come to a conclusion, and now the Allies were adding more bases of operation to hit the Japanese home islands. This episode is The Fall of Myitkyina. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over on my YouTube channel, and on all major podcast platforms, I have quite a few podcasts coming out. I'll probably be releasing about 2 a week for a little while. They're going to be covering various subjects, such as underrated moments during the Pacific War, during World War II, an entire mini-series on the North African campaign, and some rather in-depth episodes on the logistics of World War II and why logistics wins wars. And also, if you have a chance, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I'm going to be tackling next. Give it a look. This week, we are driving back over to northern Burma. Despite holding Myitkyina through a rainy, muddy, summer-long siege, by late July, the Japanese had been gradually cornered into a small perimeter, cut off from all supply lines and running short on ammunition. The situation worsened due to a leadership crisis between the two Japanese leaders, and it was a matter of semantics. Colonel Maruyama of the 114th Regiment, who was in charge of the defense of the city, interpreted his orders to, quote, facilitate the future operations of the 33rd Army by securing the vital areas in the vicinity of Myitkyina as a call to defend the city street by street and house by house. When General Myitkyina of the 56th Division arrived, he pointed out that all Maruyama had to do to satisfy his orders was simply to continue to deny the Allies access to the Lido-Kamang Road. Myitkyina thus found himself in a rather difficult position in regards to the command of the Myitkyina garrison. Maruyama had conducted an excellent defense, was fully familiar with the situation, and because of his position as a former commander, he exercised considerable authority. Shortly after Myitkyina's assumption of command, General Honda asked how long Myitkyina could stand. Myitkyina replied that the garrison might be able to hold out for as long as 2 months. A few days later, Honda was surprised to receive a second message stating, "The Myitkyina garrison finds it difficult to hold with the poor defense facilities and meager supplies of ammunition." The Army staff concluded that the first message was undoubtedly Myitkyina's personal opinion, as it reflected his determined character, and the second message incorporated the views of Maruyama, who was a more man of practicality. In order that there should be no doubt as to the importance of holding Myitkyina, Honda sent the following message. "Major General Myitkyina will defend Myitkyina to the death." A message sent with deep regret and sadness according to the staff officers who wrote and dispatched said order. Heavy casualties had reduced the Japanese forces from around 3,000 to fewer than 1,500, further weakening the garrison's defensive capabilities. This number included the heavily wounded and hospital patients who could only be evacuated by drifting down the Irrawaddy River on rafts, often intercepted by the unforgiving Kachin levies. On July the 24th, 8 rafts and a boat laden with Japanese were attacked on the Irrawaddy by Kachins of the OSS Detachment 101. 24 Japanese were killed, 2 were captured, and then it was learned that these were hospital patients fleeing Myitkyina. 3 more Japanese, seized by friendly Burmans, revealed that hospital patients were being evacuated by the simple expedient of letting them just drift down the river on rafts. As these fierce defenders began to falter, General Wles felt ready to launch his final push. Reinforced by the 149th and the 90th Regiments, the American-Chinese forces made daily gains of several hundred yards during the last days of July, though at a significant cost. As the Japanese-held area shrank, counterattacks became less dynamic, captured positions were less fortified, and many Japanese dead were found to be severely wounded men returned to the line. Unbeknownst to the Americans, the desperate defenders had requested a withdrawal to the east by the end of the month. Though Myitkyina had intended to fight to the last, he ultimately agreed to preserve his men's lives. On the night of August 1st, the Japanese began their escape, crossing the Irrawaddy east of the town. Weighing the many evidences that control of the situation was rapidly passing into their hands, Wles and his colleagues drafted a new plan of attack. It included an ingenious device credited to General Pan Yu-kun of the 50th Division. A raiding party formed into 15 heavily armed sections. They were organized and briefed on infiltrating Japanese lines facing the 50th Division. Having made their way through the Japanese lines in darkness, they were to remain there until 4:30 a.m. when the 50th would assault with the raiders, spreading confusion behind the Japanese lines. Meanwhile, aerial reconnaissance revealed many rafts moored against the Irrawaddy within the Japanese lines. At 3 a.m. on August 3rd, when the moon went down and the rain thunder set in, the raiding party of the 50th Division moved out. The approach was detected only once, and some shots were fired at the raiders, who hit the ground. The Chinese did not return fire, however, and after laying low for a while, moved out again quietly and cautiously. While the raiders created confusion behind the Japanese lines, the 50th Division launched a full attack, quickly overwhelming the remaining enemy positions and capturing 187 prisoners, thus securing Myitkyina for the Chinese. However, about 800 Japanese managed to escape eastward, and later they rejoined their allies. Myitkyina was not among them. As the 3rd of August meandered on the haze of gunfire, blood, and rain, Myitkyina went to sit with his back against a tree. There came the sound of a pistol shot. Japanese officers nearby sprinted to the scene. The general's orderlies were in tears. They found Myitkyina's body erect against the tree trunk, facing northeast towards Japan. The 10-week siege resulted in approximately 3,000 Japanese killed or captured, 972 Chinese killed, 3,184 wounded, and 188 evacuated due to illness. 272 Americans were killed, 955 were wounded, and 980 were evacuated because of sickness. Overall, the total American-Chinese casualties in 1944 amounted to 13,618 Chinese and 1,327 American casualties. A week later, the Galad unit reduced to only 130 combat-effective men from the original 2,997 was disbanded. The fall of Myitkyina was General Stillwell's greatest victory, earning him a promotion to full general on August 1st, 2 days before the city fell. The attack was costly in terms of suffering and losses, but the Mogang-Myitkyina area was a significant prize. Its capture allowed the Leader Road builders and the American transport planes to move to Myitkyina and enabled ground forces to link up with other Chinese forces in neighboring Yunnan province. As the fighting moved further south down the Hokwang and Mogang valleys, it became safer for transports to use the lower and more southerly routes to China. This in turn increased the hump deliveries to China from 13,686 tons in May of 1944 to 18,234 tons in June, and then 25,454 tons by July. While the Allies celebrated victories in northern Burma, the situation in China was quite dire, as the Ichigo offensive resulted in many Chinese casualties. By August 1st, General Yokoyama had amassed 110,000 troops around Hengyang, equipped with 5 heavy artillery pieces, 50 mountain artillery pieces, and 40,000 shells. Conversely, General Fang's resilient defenders had dwindled to about 3,000 exhausted troops, with their defenses largely destroyed. General Shiyue's reinforcements had failed to reach Hengyang, leaving the Chinese forces to rely on the 46th Army to launch an attack along the railway. On August the 4th, Yokoyama initiated his main offensive. The 68th and 116th Divisions launched a significant assault from the south and southwest, while the 58th Division quietly positioned itself near the enemy's northern defenses. Initially, progress was quite slow. However, by August the 5th, Yokoyama's forces had captured Yoping and the School Hill. The next day, the 116th Division secured part of the city's defenses. On August the 6th, the 58th Division breached the city walls from the north, forcing General Fang to redeploy his troops to counter this new threat. Intense street fighting broke out on August the 7th as the defenders valiantly tried to repel the Japanese attacks. By nightfall, the 68th Division had overrun the southern defenses and entered part of the walled city. Gradually, enemy troops began to surrender, and before dawn on August the 8th, after 48 days of fierce resistance, General Fang was compelled to surrender. Following the capture of Hengyang, Yokoyama declared the successful completion of the initial phase of Operation Togo, and promptly began preparations for the subsequent offensive. In this phase, the Japanese reported casualties over 3,860 killed, 8,327 wounded, and 7,099 sick, with an estimated Chinese casualty rate exceeding 100,000, including 8,400 killed and 5,000 captured in Hengyang alone. To spearhead the next stage of Operation Togo, targeting Guilin and Lozhou, General Okimura Yasuyoji's 6th Area Army was established on August 25th, comprising the 11th, 23rd, and 34th Armies, along with the 27th, 40th, 64th, and 68th Divisions, alongside some additional support units. This allowed General Hata to focus on countering potential American landings on the Chinese coast, while Okimura directed the offensives in eastern China. Ahead of this operation, Lieutenant General Tanaka Hisakazu of the 23rd Army initiated a preliminary offensive in late June, positioning the 23rd Independent Mixed Brigade in the northeastern sector of the Lujiao Peninsula, advancing the 22nd Independent Mixed Brigade to the Tianjin River, securing the Jiangmen area with the 22nd Division, and capturing the Qingyuan sector with the 104th Division. By late August, Yokoyama had deployed 6 divisions along the Shengfang-Leyang line, poised to eliminate the enemy in the district west of Hengyang. On August 29th, he launched the offensive with over 100,000 troops advancing southwest amidst heavy artillery bombardment. Intense ground and aerial combat ensued, resulting in the loss of 10 Japanese planes and 15 enemy aircraft. Despite fierce resistance from Chinese defenders, over 3 days, the entire line collapsed on September the 1st, prompting a retreat towards Shaoyang, Qiyang, and Jiahe. However, the Japanese advanced relentlessly, covering nearly 100 kilometers in the following days without any pause. By September the 5th, both Qiyang and Hochangpijian had fallen, followed by the seizure of Lingling and her associated airdrome on September the 8th by the 3rd Division. Progressing along the north-south axis, Japanese forces secured Shaoyang and Changning, while the 58th Division captured Dong'an on the same day. With initial objectives achieved, Yokoyama ordered further pursuit, with the 3rd and 54th Divisions converging in the Changzhou area by September the 14th. Meanwhile, Tanaka prepared for his offensive, with the bulk of the 104th Division moving towards Taipingjian, and a raiding unit conducted a wide envelopment maneuver along the Jiukang-Huanqi roads towards Wuzhou by September the 6th. Subsequently, the 23rd Brigade began its northward march from Suxi. However, Tanaka's offensive wouldn't commence for a couple of weeks. Turning to the broader context of the Pacific War, General Stillwell celebrated a major victory with the fall of Myitkyina, while General Slim's successful defense against Operation Yugo further bolstered Allied morale in the CBI theater. Now over in a place we haven't talked about in quite some time, that of Thailand, Prime Minister Phibun's regime faced a significant crisis as Japan struggled to meet the country's essential import needs, leading to inflation, rationing, shortages, black markets, smuggling, corruption, and profiteering. The anti-Japanese Free Thai underground movement, spearheaded by Regent Priti Bonamyang, infiltrated the government, stoking public discontent against both the Japanese occupiers and Phibun's administration. Following the downfall of the Tojo government, Phibun found himself compelled to step down in late July. For his part, Phibun was also thinking of ways, he claims, to prepare to turn against the Japanese. Part of these preparations included proposals to move the capital to the more remote Phetchabun, north of Bangkok, and construct a Buddhist city, a sort of center for the world of Buddhism, near Saraburi. This would have been a grandiose project and quite typical of the rather extravagant Phibun style. Moving to the isolated mountain-ringed Phetchabun, Phibun later argued would facilitate a Thai uprising against the Japanese. Yet on July the 18th, the Tojo government in Japan resigned, and only 6 days later, the Thai National Assembly turned down both government bills and forced the resignation of Phibun as prime minister. The deputies in the assembly voted against these plans, motivated in part by the fall of Tojo, who was closely associated in their minds with Phibun. In part by their feeling that the war was really turning against Japan, and in part by their feeling that Phibun was too closely identified with an authoritarian past that must now be buried for the sake of improving relations with the Allies. Politician Kwang Afawang then assumed the position of prime minister on August 1st. Serving as a compromise candidate, he navigated between Phibun's supporters and the opposition while maintaining cooperation with the Japanese and safeguarding the Free Thai members who had collaborated with the Allies. Meanwhile, in China, the success of Operation Ichigo led to another leadership crisis. Despite the initial rejection of Stillwell commanding troops in China in 1942, the effective Japanese offensive posed a threat to the defeat of the Chinese government. And this reignited the debate over the command authority. This was especially significant as Chinese troops under Stillwell's command were achieving significant victories in northern Burma. However, Stillwell's vocal criticism of Chiang Kai-shek's corrupt regime and incompetent generals strained their relationship. Chiang Kai-shek favored General Chennault, who proposed that with a monthly allocation of 10,000 tons of supplies for operations in northern China, his 14th Air Force could probably halt the Japanese offensive. Despite his strained relationship with Chennault, Stillwell redirected hump allocations to increase the 14th Air Force's allocations to about 8,425 tons, although he couldn't secure the additional 1,500 tons from the Matterhorn allocation. Chennault's aircraft managed to disrupt the Japanese advance but failed to halt it completely. In late June, Stillwell faced criticism when Vice President Henry Wallace visited Chongqing. While Wallace persuaded Chiang Kai-shek to allow a small American observer mission into communist territory, he also recommended Stillwell's recall due to his perceived lack of diplomacy and strained relations with the Chinese leadership. Nonetheless, Stillwell maintained the backing of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and President Roosevelt eventually nominated him to lead the China Theater, on the condition that he make every possible effort to avoid upsetting the Generalissimo. In July, the president attempted to persuade Chiang Kai-shek to accept this arrangement, but the Generalissimo employed various diplomatic maneuvers to reject the proposal, agreeing in principle only after an unspecified period of his forces had time to adjust. He also requested the presence of a presidential representative to facilitate smoother relations between himself and Stillwell. Major General Patrick Hurley was appointed to this role, and he arrived to China in August. Concurrently, the Dixie mission arrived in Yan'an, where over the following months American observers assessed the Communist society, military tactics, and guerrilla operations, issuing reports that commended them and suggested increasing collaboration efforts. Following the fall of Hanyang, tensions escalated in China, with rumors swirling about a potential coup involving Marshal Li Zhongren and General Xu Yue against the Generalissimo. Meanwhile, Chennault urged Stillwell to divert hump airlift capacity to supply ground forces in eastern China, a move that was opposed by Chiang Kai-shek, who feared supporting potential insurgents with Lend-Lease equipment. Stillwell, anticipating his imminent assumption of leadership in the China theater, refrained from challenging Chiang Kai-shek's stance. With significant developments looming, the intensifying rift between Stillwell and Chiang Kai-shek foreshadowed the downfall of one of them. Now, elsewhere in the South Pacific, General MacArthur's troops had finished their final offensive in New Guinea, and they were preparing to return to the Philippines by the way of an intermediate stop at Halmahera Island. Over to the east, Rabaul was completely surrounded, enduring heavy bombardment from Allied forces. Meanwhile, on Bougainville, the remaining forces of the 17th Army had retreated to the island's southern region, unable to launch further counterattacks. The living conditions of the Japanese soldiers, never good under the best of circumstances, became increasingly desperate. Added to the dangers that forward troops always faced, such a contact with large American combat patrols was the growing specter of starvation. Sealed off from the regular supplies from New Ireland or New Britain, General Hyakutaki's army had to depend entirely on its own laborers to acquire food. The normal rice ration of 750 grams of rice for each soldier was cut in April of 1944 to just 250 grams, and beginning in September, there was no rice ration. A large portion of the available Army and naval personnel had to be put to work at growing food. Allied pilots took delight in dropping napalm on these garden plots whenever they were found. The native workers who had been pressed into service were the first to defect, but soon many soldiers also just began walking away from their units, taking the chance of surviving in the jungle on whatever they could gather. After the failure of the March attack, morale in most units became deplorably low. There were instances, normally unimagined in the Japanese army, of open insubordination and even mutiny. Although General Hakatake dreamed of a midsummer offensive, it became quite obvious that no such operations, certainly not as large, could possibly be smashed out in March, and they were not going to be undertaken for months, if ever. Thus, almost as if by agreement, both sides adopted a defensive posture that minimalized any conflict in a sort of no man's land between them. In the Central Pacific, significant progress had been made over the past year, marked by the complete capture of the Gilbert, Marshall, and Mariana Islands, strengthening the Allied presence and providing a launching point for future offensives aimed into the heart of the Japanese Empire. The next target for Admiral Nimitz was to be the Palos Islands, to be invaded concurrently with Halmahera. However, the architect of this southwestern advance was not Admiral Spruance, who had been overseeing operations with the Fifth Fleet. Instead, it was Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, known as the Department of Dirty Tricks, that had been strategizing the next moves from Hawaii. Now, Admiral Halsey was set to assume command of the Pacific Fleet, leading the charge to the Palau and then the Philippines. This rotation in leadership between Halsey's Third Fleet and Spruance's Fifth Fleet was orchestrated by Nimitz to maintain operational tempo and to confuse the Japanese. The alternating command structure allowed for continuous planning of future operations while the active fleet conducted current ones. Tokyo was apprehensive about a potential invasion of the Philippines and sought to bolster its defenses. Following the surrender of the U.S. Army forces in the Philippines, the 14th Army, led by General Tanaka Shizuki, worked to establish military administration, secure cooperation from civilian institutions, and quell guerrilla groups across the countryside. Despite their endeavors, their control over certain regions, particularly in the Visayas and Mindanao, remained fragile. Allied submarines and aircraft from Australia and New Guinea were delivering supplies like signal equipment, weapons, explosives, propaganda materials, and counterfeit currency to support the guerrilla forces, further impeding Japanese efforts. Additionally, with the deteriorating situation in the South and Central Pacific, more troops were redirected from the Philippines garrison to other areas, weakening the 14th Army, now commanded by Lieutenant General Kurada Shigenori, since May of 1943. Undermanned and stretched thin, the Japanese halted their suppression operations in August, hoping that imminent declaration of independence by the Second Philippine Republic would lead guerrillas to surrender. However, this strategy backfired, as the guerrillas only grew stronger during the pause. Consequently, Kuroda restarted intensive suppression operations in 1944, but guerrilla activities escalated in anticipation of the imminent liberation by American forces. As a result, the guerrillas gained strength in the following months, providing valuable intelligence to MacArthur's forces in preparation for their eventual return. Given this context, it was evident that the 14th Army would be ill-equipped to withstand an American invasion under the current circumstances. Due to its crucial strategic location, bridging Japan, and the southern region that was rich in natural resources, Japan couldn't risk losing the Philippines. It served as their primary rear base, supporting the main defensive perimeter. The Philippines were also to play the role of a rear base of operations, an assembly and staging area for troops and supplies, and a concentration area for air services, to support operations at any threatened point on the main defensive perimeter from the Marianas south to the western New Guinea and to the Banda Sea area. To implement these plans, IGHQ in October of 1943 directed the 14th Army to complete the establishment of the necessary base facilities by the spring of 1944. Major emphasis in the program was laid upon the construction of air bases. The Army also planned to build or improve 30 fields in addition to 13 already in operational use or partially completed. The Navy projected 21 fields and seaplane bases to be ready for operational use by the end of 1944, expanding its total number of Philippine bases to 33. Line of communications and other rear area base installations were also to be expanded and improved upon. Of the 30 Army airfields projected in October of 1943, 6 had been generally completed by May of 1944, and 24 were under construction. Of the 21 projected Navy fields, 15 were still incomplete by then. Consequently, in early 1944, the decision was made to strengthen the garrison in the Philippines. Initially, this involved reorganizing and expanding existing garrison units to establish 4 new independent mixed brigades. These brigades were primarily tasked with suppressing guerrilla activity, while infantry divisions were assigned to defend against potential enemy landings. However, despite the estimation that at least 7 divisions were necessary for the defense of Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, only the 16th Division was available. Additionally, it was deemed crucial to bolster air strength with at least 2 air divisions, anticipating Allied invasions in Halmahera and the Palaos before advancing to the Philippines. Plans were formulated in March to deploy reinforcements within 8 months. In mid-May, General Tarachi relocated his headquarters to Manila to oversee operations more closely. Concurrently, efforts were made to transport the 30th Division to Mindanao and to bring the 4th Air Army to Manila. Furthermore, the Philippines were reinforced with the 2nd and 4th Air Divisions, the latter being tasked with construction of 30 new airfields. In June, approximately 20,000 inexperienced replacements were transported to the Philippines to bolster the recently formed independent mixed brigades, filling them up to divisional strength. Subsequently, in July, the 100th, 102nd, 103rd, and 105th Divisions were activated, along with the establishment of the 54th and 55th Independent Mixed Brigades. It's ironic that despite the reinforcement, the main Japanese forces were as inexperienced as the Philippine Army during MacArthur's defenses. Nonetheless, Tarachi was resolute in further fortifying the Philippines to prevent its fall, unlike MacArthur's situation. By mid-July, the reinforced 58th Independent Mixed Brigade arrived in Ligayan. Later that month, the 14th Army underwent reorganization into the 14th Area Army, with its units directly under the command tasked with defending the northern Philippines. Meanwhile, the 35th Army, led by Lieutenant General Suzuki Sozaki, was established under the 14th Area Army to defend Mindanao and Visayas. Additionally, Tokyo finalized plans for decisive battle operations, codenamed Shogo, covering the Philippines, Formosa, Ryukyus, Japan, and Kurils area. This determined the disposition of Army and Naval Air Forces across the Pacific, with the Philippines receiving the reorganized 1st and 2nd Air Fleets and the 4th Air Army. The Philippine garrison was strengthened to a total of 9 divisions and 4 brigades, with the 1st Division at Shanghai and the 68th Independent Mixed Brigade at Formosa designated as General Reserves. Defenses and fortifications were constructed at Luzon in preparation for the decisive battle there. Known as the Combined Fleet Top Secret Operations Order No. 84, issued on August 1st, this fixed the new tactical grouping of naval forces for the Shogo operations. Almost the entire surface combat strength of the fleet was included in a task force placed under the overall command of the 1st Mobile Fleet Commander, Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo. This force was broken down into 3 tactical groups. The first was Task Force Main Body, directed and commanded by Vice Admiral Ozawa, and consisting of most of the 3rd Fleet carrier forces. The second was the 1st Striking Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Kurita Takeo. It was made up of the 2nd Fleet with part of the 10th Destroyer Squadron attached. The third was the 2nd Striking Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Shima Kiyohide. It was composed of the 5th Fleet plus 2 destroyer divisions and the battleships Fuzo and Yamashiro. The 1st Striking Force would be stationed in the Linga anchorage, with the Task Force Main Body and the 2nd Striking Force, who would be stationed in the west part of the inland sea. However, if an enemy attack was expected, the 1st Striking Force would advance from Linga anchorage to Brunei, Coron, or the Guimaras, while the Task Force Main Body and the 2nd Striking Force remained in the inland sea and prepared to attack the north flank of the enemy task force. During August, the Navy section of the Imperial General Headquarters also took action to give the combined fleet more unified operational control of naval forces in order to facilitate the execution of the Shogo plans. On the 9th of August, General Escort Command and units assigned to naval stations were placed under operational command of the combined fleet, and on the 21st of August, the China Area Fleet was similarly placed under the combined fleet's command. On the 10th of August, the 1st Carrier Division, reorganized around 2 newly commissioned regular carriers, was added to the Task Force Main Body. Vice Admiral Ozawa, meanwhile, set October the 15th as the target date for the completion of the reorganization and training of the 3rd and 4th Carrier Division air groups. Concurrently with these preparations, steps were taken to strengthen the anti-aircraft armament of combat units. Accordingly, the Japanese sought to deploy the 8th and 26th Divisions, the 2nd Tank Division, and the 61st Independent Mixed Brigade to Luzon's region for decisive battle. However, enemy submarines posed a constant threat. Since February, they had been patrolling the South China Sea, targeting the high convoys supplying Japanese territories in Southeast Asia and Japan itself. During these engagements, Admiral Ijun was killed aboard the patrol boat Iki. Between August 18th and 25th, Admiral Koichiaka's High 71 convoy carrying the 26th Division was attacked by 6 American submarines. The escort carrier Taiyo, destroyers Unagi and Asakaze, 2 oilers, 4 transports, and 3 kaibokans were all sunk, with 7,420 soldiers of the 26th Division lost. The submarine Harder was the only American vessel sunk in retaliation. Gaijioka's High 72 convoy returning from Luzon was also attacked, resulting in the sinking of his flagship, the Kaibokan Hirato, and the loss of the destroyer Shikinami, alongside 3 transports and 1 oiler. Despite these setbacks, advanced units of the 8th Division, 2nd Tank Division, and the 61st Independent Mixed Brigade successfully reached the Philippines in September. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, over at YouTube and on all podcast platforms. I actually have quite a few podcasts coming out. The next one is going to be about underrated moments of World War II. Also, if you have a chance, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. Give it a look. After many brutal months, the siege of Myitkyina had finally ended. The Japanese had held out as long as they could, but lack of supplies and rather terrible leadership lost them the fight. Meanwhile, in China, Japanese offensives intensified, challenging Chinese defenses and leadership. It seemed the war was coming to the Philippines, where the Japanese prepared for a fight to the death.